Starting this week with how much money we're spending on Michigan's schools. Is it enough? And are we spending it on the right things? Governor Snyder gave his last budget proposal this week. He wants to up K-12 spending to its highest levels in 15 years, raising the foundation allowance by $312 million. Public universities get only a 2% bump, and Snyder wants to fund his Marshall Plan idea he launched at the State of the State, connecting students to in-demand careers. But we still don't have a full account of that program. Now, we're not going to dissect each part of the budget because Nolan would protest and then promptly fall asleep, but how Lansing wants to spend our money is a big deal. And if you look at the abysmal test scores and reading levels that we've racked up in recent years compared to the rest of the country, you'll want to know not only how much money we're throwing at the problem, but are the resources in the right place to make a difference. Let's bring in Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of WDET. Now, weren't you excited when I said budget?
Oh, yeah, I am. I think it's always, everyone waits for this week every year to see, all right,
how are we spending
what are the
our
things
money?
that we're going to do? What's going to be different? Are we going to have some great big
nobody
new program?
does that.
I do.
You know what? I think everyone does. Don't you want to see exactly what we're spending our money on, and especially when it comes to education? That's
He's
what I
already
really
bored.
wanted
We
to
haven't even
focus
started
on.
talking
No,
yet.
no, you can't be bored yet.
I'm
Nolan.
not. You know, there's some interesting things in this budget, particularly when it comes to education, and we've been dealing with the funding gap since Prop 8 was passed, where where holdover districts, high tax districts got a bigger grant from the state than poorer districts did, and it just exacerbated the inequalities between the rich and poor districts. This budget goes a long way to closing that gap. The poorer districts get $240 more per pupil. This is a huge increase in the budget for the per-pupil grant, which is unrestricted.
And you have to think that educators are pleased about this. Again, this is back up for the highest it's been in 15 years. Well, but they have to give a little bit and say, look, at least some of the funding is coming back up again.
Right.
But is it going to make the difference that we need?
I mean, it depends on how they use it, right?
That's it.
And I've said for a long time that we have a funding problem with schools in education in Michigan, and that's true. We have fallen way behind other states in the way that we, not just the amount of money we give, but how we give it. And this budget does, I think, go a long way to trying to even out the gap between rich and poor. But I've also said that it's not just money, right? We have all these other systemic issues in the way we govern schools, in the way that we decide what they're going to do in classrooms, that it's also out of sync with other states. And so, you know, maybe if you marry them up together, if you get more money and be more meticulous about how we manage schools, we can actually start climbing back up the ladder.
Well, you would get some complaints from people saying, if we want to do innovative things, or we need more teachers in the classroom, or if we need more support staff, that is going to take funding. So in essence, it always comes back down to funding. And so where is this innovative new funding going to come from, or should we be kind of blowing up the system? Because we talk about how we fund our schools. We've talked about this for a number of years now, and it's always well, we need X amount, and a dollar amount was put on during a study that the state commissioned a couple years ago, and then piggybacked on the governor's 21st Century Education Commission report.
So all in, we spend ninth most in the nation per pupil on education. We ought to be able to do a lot better than 45th, 46th, 47th in the nation on student performance. And so I believe there is some correlation between money and school performance, but obviously it's not as direct as the folks who did this adequacy story would have us believe. We have an education system in this state, a structure that discourages innovation. It's too rigid. There's been too many hands in it. The legislature has set standards for education. The governor has, the Board of Education. We need a more directly accountable structure in this state for running the schools. You can't have both an elected governor and an elected school board equal in running education, and the legislature on the side deciding every pet peeve it has about what goes in the classroom. They encode it in law. You don't have a system that allows teachers to do their best within the classrooms.
Okay, so we've had this debate now for about a year, talking about should we be changing the governance structure of how we deal with education, and yet we've seen nothing happen.
That's right.
I was gonna say, are we actually having that debate?
No,
Like,
no,
who's
we've
having
had
that
this debate
you
here
mean
on
here at the
the
table.
MiWeek
Nobody's
table. We've
listening
had
to
that
I was going to
debate.
say, I don't feel like anyone in
Absolutely.
Lansing is actually
Well,
talking about that.
There's a bill that's been introduced now. It'll go nowhere.
There's a task force, I think, that's still waiting out there
but
somewhere.
it's the right thing to do. You need to fold the Board of Education, the Education Department in the state government, and hold the governor accountable. Because right now you can have a governor saying, "I'm the education governor," and then
do we have a governor saying that right now, though?
No, but I said you could have, and you get to the end, they say, "Well, the state board, you know, they did this and they did that." There's no direct accountability.
Okay, so I was doing some digging on school finance. Very exciting. And I came across the School Finance Research Collaborative. So for the last year, they were funded by Kellogg and Skillman and Mott. For the last year, they've been taking a look at how we do fund our schools in the state of Michigan, and they just came out with a big report in January, taking a look at some of the numbers, and they said that the base per pupil cost that we should be looking at is actually $9,590 per student, and that is a lot more than already what the base.
Or that's 2,000 more than what we're dealing with
Well,
now,
when you fold in all the money, we're spending about $12,000 on average across the state. But again,
and that's a base student.
that's
We're not taking into account even special ed or kids that have extreme impairment.
Because that's actually, I mean, the difference between the 7 and the 12 is things that we probably shouldn't be spending money in the way that we spend them on, but you can't count that as like classroom spending. It's not.
But
so
we've got a system here that no matter how much money we raise and spend, our unmet obligations, our long-term pension and health care obligations gobbles up the biggest chunk of any increase in spending. It's been a losing battle for a decade or more, where we increase education spending and 2/3 of it goes to meet the pension shortfall, which we've never dealt with. But I think the basic problem, I come to the conclusion, basic problem in Michigan is we just don't give a damn about education here. Your Child organization released a poll this week that showed only 35% of parents felt passionately about the performance of the schools, in the state. I mean,
35%, because I'm sitting here as a parent and I'm saying I feel very passionately about
that's you, but that
what
ain't all,
direction our schools
that ain't
are
all
heading
your
into.
neighbors, because when you've got 2/3 of the state parents apathetic about the performance of schools, nothing's going to make it better. No proposal, no reform, no amount of money is going to make it. The parents have to want this, and we've never in Michigan wanted a good education system more than we've wanted some other things.
Right.
Well, let me ask you this too. Something else in the budget that jumped at me looking at education. You only have a 2% bump for public universities, and when we look back at the decisions that Amazon made about not even putting Detroit in the top 20, and looking at when we say education, part of that too is the number of higher ed degrees that we have here in the state of Michigan, and that might be also correlating with making college a little bit more affordable for kids to be able to get to and to go to and to graduate. But yet, so while there is the infusion of money there through K-12, and again, it's a good level, it's still lagging behind at the university level.
We are so far behind on higher ed funding when you compare, again, to other states that are getting better outcomes, that 2% barely keeps us where we are. It helps keeps us falling behind. We've got to really think about, and Nolan's point about this passion that you need among parents, among citizens, to say higher ed and K-12 are, golden priorities that we're willing to really invest in. You're not going to get, if you can't get that going, you're not going to start moving back up the ladder. We're moving down. We're not moving up. But again,
you have to have accountability. These universities have been completely aloof from fiscal discipline, fiscal responsibility.
It's actually not true.
It is true, Steve. It is true. They have surpassed inflation by 2 and 3, 4 times every year for the last 20 years.
But they also are making sure that the money that they're spending goes to actual achievement and research and things like that. It's not like they're just sitting around throwing money away.
They certainly, in a lot of cases, they are.
It's expensive to run a top-notch university.
There's a lot of brick and mortar obsession on these campuses.
But we're not paying for that, really. That's all fun donors.
Taking money that could have gone to maybe a scholarship endowments, and you all are your former papers. We had a good series this week about that U of M not using that endowment for.
But that's not what endowments are for.
To relieve student
Look,
tuition.
I'm gonna push back on something that you guys mentioned just a minute ago about the fact that parents aren't being forceful enough, or that parents don't care enough, and that until we stand up and say we want some kind of change, but maybe parents haven't felt like they can be totally listened to, or anything that they say is going to make any kind of difference in how their schools are governed at the local level.
That may be some of it. I also think that there is a cultural imperative that's taken hold that says to people, more money, more tax money, more money that you have to pay into government somehow doesn't translate into better results. Now, some of that is about us having not held people accountable for results. I mean, I think we've done things in the past that have let money go to education and haven't resulted in the gains that we wanted. But I also think that there's a very cynical political narrative that gets pushed by one side of the political spectrum that says government can't do anything right. Government can't perform, so don't give them your money. Keep your money, and you decide how to spend it, and things will be okay. And the truth is,
can you blame how people feel about government these days?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean,
look what just happened in Washington, for God's sakes.
You can point to any number of reasons that government doesn't perform the way it should. But what's the answer to that? Is the answer to that to starve it of money so that it can't perform? Or is it to fund it properly so that it does perform?
But how do you,
and the
how do you
narrative
know
is
whether you're
getting
funding
pushed the other
properly
way.
or not when nobody ever stops to see how the money is
and
being
they should
spent
be doing that.
and setting priorities?
Well, and I also think it's the testing too, and the results of the testing, and that's the only marker that we can really see is what we're doing working. And when you keep changing the test and you don't have any kind of consistency over a 5-year period or a 3-year period, then you keep changing how teachers are teaching, because some of them are teaching to the test because they know if they don't get the numbers that they're supposed to be, that they are in trouble.
But there's other ways to teach. We're test obsessed, and there's other ways to teach and other ways to measure.
It goes back to your innovation point.
But we
understand.
have tied our own hands with all of these legislation governing what goes on in the classroom. We've tied our own hands when it comes to innovation.
I think it's going to be interesting when we look at the governor's race now in this next year, where education is going to be on the priority list for each of the candidates, and if that will be a large sticking point for people
I will
who
make
are
a
voting.
prediction that neither one of these candidates will talk about the radical kinds of rethinking of education that we need to become like Florida or Tennessee or Massachusetts or any of the.
We need to blow it up.
Right. I mean, we do it wrong.
Maybe that comes back. Maybe that comes back then to the constituency. That comes back to the parents. That comes back to people here and says, yes, we demand some kind of.
I mean, look at the money we could save just employing better technology, both at the university level and at the K-12 level. Universities balk at using more internet classrooms and what have you. There's a traditionalist attitude that keeps us from innovating and saving money.
I'm not sure that's
I don't know.
my
third grader is still dragging on an iPad.
The culture is sometimes.
All right. Well,